Hello, everyone. Oh, my dog is barking. It's such a privilege to be here with you. I learned a lot exploring this topic, how Swedenborgian theology addresses the challenging issues of the pandemic and increasing violence in our society. And we'll incorporate such theological themes as the influence of heaven and hell, the purpose of this life, and a last judgment. My name is Reverend Renee Machiniak. I live in Royal Oak, Michigan. I serve the Royal Oak Church of the Holy City. I've been here doing that since I was ordained 25 plus years ago. And I'm also a hospice chaplain, hospital chaplain, and police chaplain, and very much enjoy serving as the youth chaplain presently for our denomination. So I'm doing this mini course out of my perceived need of people around me who bring up these two topics, the pandemic and the increasing violence in our society. There are two issues that are brought up the most on Sunday morning. I would say these are the two issues that are troubling the hearts and the minds of the people that I love. And it sounds like because you're all here with me, that they're also on your mind and heart. I first like to thank Emily and Alex for your help. So let's start with the issue of increasing violence in our country and in our world. Violent crime is at an epidemic level, yet it is not a modern issue. Violence has been with us since Adam and Eve. However, what is relatively modern, if we're looking at the whole arc of history, is the Swedenborgian perspective on violence. But before I share that, very briefly, I'd like to share my own experience with violence. I do that to convey an authentic sense of the devastating effects of violence and the long-range blessings that have emerged through time. I was molested at the age of 3 by a neighbor boy. I was bullied repeatedly for 2 years in junior high in Los Angeles. And I was raped by 3 men as a young woman in college. So I speak to you today as a survivor, not only a theologian and a minister, but as a survivor, as a wounded healer, as a child of God who is holy in that. And I serve out of these experiences, and I help them to make use in my relationships with the people I walk next to, the people that I serve, and the people who need compassionate presence and hope. The devastating effects manifest in both physical ways with health challenges that I live with, and psychological, spiritual fear and strengthening. I have been able to use what I have been through to grow in my faith, to serve God, and in psychological and spiritual counseling with those that seek help. I do this in various ways, and I've done this in various ways, and I want this group because I want to convey a message of hope more than anything else. I want you to hear the kinds of specific ways that I have been able to live a useful life from the violence that I have suffered. I co-facilitated a support group for battered women when I was at SSR in seminary. I specialized in the psychiatric unit as a chaplain, not only with the oncology patients, but the women who were battered and abused. I supported battered women, and I continue to do that as a police chaplain, and I'm the one they call out in our city when there's domestic violence. And I offer my congregation and those who come, who visit, who have backgrounds of trauma. I serve from my own place of experienced violence so that I can serve and be a compassionate human angel in that light. So everything that I have suffered has brought me closer to God as a choice. And it has served to inform me in my various ministries to help others. Nothing that I have been through has been wasted. Everything has been put to use. And if you have questions about this later, I'm transparent and open about that. So now that I've briefly shared my background, a summary overview of the prevalence of violence today, I start because I have a heart for our youth. Over 700 children in this past year have been killed by gun violence. 700, over 700. According to the Washington Post, the year 2020 was the deadliest gun violence year in decades, and 2021 is worse. The shootings have come at a relentless pace, and gun violence has cut through our celebrations, our funerals, our houses of worship, our places of work. It's taken lives at grocery stores and fast food drive-through lanes. It's unfolded in our streets and among our people of color, our brothers and sisters, in our families, in our homes. Through the first 5 months of 2021, gunfire killed, get this, more than 8,100 souls. More than 8,100 people in the United States. That's about 54 lives lost per day. And this is data from analysis from the Gun Violence Archive, a nonprofit research organization. Experts have attributed the increase to a variety of new and long-standing issues, including entrenched inequality. So gun violence, like COVID-19, takes an unequal toll on communities of color. Soaring gun ownership, fraying relationships between police and the communities that they serve. And of course, all of this intensified during the pandemic and widespread uprisings for racial justice. So if we read about or we watch the news regularly, we already know all this. But I want to reach our hearts today. These numbers are way too high. One person lost is too high, and it feels overwhelming. And I'm picking up in our youth, and I'm sure our adults as well, an increasing hopelessness and a sense of empty meaninglessness about life because we're getting out of control and the chaos is overwhelming us. The Swedenborgian perspective helps us to understand violence at its source and to see the big picture regarding where we are headed, and possibly a hopeful future. Our doctrine gives us the big picture spiritually, and our doctrine gives us hope. Most people think of violence only as an outward act of coming toward another to do harm, and it is that. But the deeper truth is the opposite of that. So from the Swedenborgian perspective, first we see violence as an outward act to harm another. But at a deeper level, it is a profound withdrawal from what is good and what is true. There can be no violence unless there is first a withdrawal from what is good and true. And this seems to be happening more and more. We are withdrawing at many levels. Now, there is one exception to violence as a withdrawal, but we'll get to that later. The intent to harm with violence is a deadness in one's relationship to God, to others, and to self. There is not only an emptiness in the inner life, but also a desire to take life from another, a true twisting of the good toward evil. So it is a withdrawal into darkness. And what this suggests is that the antidote to violence must be promulgated or made widely known first and foremost by the church. The church is obviously not fulfilling that role well enough yet. And we see this because the root spiritual cause of violence is not talked about enough, and violence is increasing. In essence, faith and charity are declining, and self-centeredness is on the rise. And perhaps what we need, among many other serious things, would be a Swedenborgian type Billy Graham preacher on mass media, reaching out effectively to those who would listen and those who might withdraw into violence. And I think of Karen File at the Chicago Library. She's often talking, I'm often hearing her speak wisely about how do we get this message out there. And I agree. I think that's part of what we must do. And of course, there are many other worldly reasons for this withdrawal into violence, not only that the church isn't addressing it, such as broken families, economic poverty, racism, isolation, addictions, hopelessness, meaninglessness, and other significant causes. This is truly complex. But today we're here to think about the root, the cause. These are all ultimately symptoms of a disorder at a much deeper level. The root cause is withdrawal from our source, withdraw from the divine. How many of us have even thought of violence as withdraw? Swedenborg invites us to consider that the spiritual realm is the first and primary cause of all things, that God acts and we respond or not. The spiritual realm acts first and the natural follows. Whether we are talking about plants growing in our garden or people reacting with violence, the spiritual is always causal, and we respond with it, we respond in accord to it, or against it. Thus, the origin of violence is spiritual. It is hell. It is a reaction, a withdrawal, away from what is good and true. So when acts of violence are committed, the hells are active. Again, one more time, violence is an act of withdrawal from the first cause. We can see this in the Lord's life. The people that were the most violent toward Jesus rejected him and rejected his claim to be the Son of God. They moved away from him. And those who inflicted violence on Jesus withdrew from him. They were in positions of power. They were involved in love of self alone and in contempt for those who did not support their authority, their power. Now, a very powerful quote from Heaven and Hell, Swedenborg number 587. In the farthest reaches of hell, people want to be worshipped as gods, and they flare up with hatred and vengefulness at anyone who do not acknowledge their power over other souls and over heaven itself. What we're talking about in the farthest reaches of hell is love of power, love of dominion over others, not with others, over. And from True Christian Religion number 55, Swedenborg says, the spheres of hell are perpetually endeavoring, get this, to do violence against what is good and true. There you have it. There's the source. There's where the root is of the violence we're seeing today. They are perpetually endeavoring to do violence against what is good and true. And the divine protects those who are in good and truth from this hellish sphere at that level, at the spiritual level. For unless these are preserved in divine order, it would be as if the body were made bare and exposed to the heat of summer, the cold of winter, or as if the roof and the walls were removed from the temple, and the sanctuary and the altar and the pulpit were openly exposed to various kinds of violence. We read this in Swedenborg all over the place. The hells seek to do violence, to rip us bare, body, mind, and spirit. Violence from the hellish spheres breathes its influence into us on earth. We'd better be awake and aware. It's coming through all of us. So it's not about violently pointing our finger. It's not about being violent back, but we have the ability to do it. Now, let's go back to the one exception to violence that is not a withdrawal, is not an act of withdrawal. And that is in any justifiable war like World War II, when human life was at stake. Basic spiritual freedom was at stake, democracy at stake. Hitler wanted to take over the whole world. There's that love of dominion again. And like a cancer to the body, these situations must be stopped. The good must act and protect in justifiable situations, which are few and far between. Now, evil can invade the church as well. It can invade with violence, but in sneaky ways, usually. The church is evil's favorite place to hide out, and it tries to make a valid case for it in the name of virtue. So remember the Crusades, the KKK, and the people who justify violence using doctrine. We're talking about all forms: physical violence, emotional violence, and spiritual violence. In the church, there can be, we know, a misinterpretation of what is right and good in order to make violence justifiable, either in body, mind, or spirit, or any combination of these. And when this happens, the church has lost its faith, and the church has lost charity. Now let's explore the second troubling modern issue, the coronavirus pandemic. And then we're going to move into what I think is the most fascinating doctrine of Swedenborg's about the Last Judgement. And it gives us great hope, and it's very interesting. So the pandemic itself is a form of violence to our bodies, to our minds, to our relationships with each other and with God. And it has emerged from our choices over time. They have their root, these choices, in the two loves of hell. That is the love of self alone and love of the world. Swedenborg makes a disturbing statement. In summary, if human beings do not address evil, specific evil, when they come up, then there will be a reaction, a consequence that will not be pleasant for our sake, ultimately, because we must see our wrongdoing before we can change that. We must see. That consequence can be in a relationship between individuals or between nations. It can be somatic and have medical consequences for an individual or a group, a nation, or the world. And this we see in our day, a consequence for the world called COVID-19. This spiritual law is tough. It's harsh. But as I attempt to understand the Lord's point of view, what's even harsher for us than any consequence is lack of recognition of what is evil. Because in the end, too much unrecognized evil leads to devastating separation from the divine. Here we have it. That is the number one thing the divine protects against, is our separation from what is good. We could potentially become unreachable. And this is guarded against all else. And perhaps from the Lord's point of view, being unreachable is worse than temporary physical suffering, even though it might go on for years. It is still temporary as we view life in terms of the eternal. And in addition, the Lord has the perfect perspective on what we know to be death, which is something temporary as well, less significant than being unreachable. Jesus showed us in his own life by being willing to suffer, by willing to be on the cross. And as horrible as that was, he showed us that physical suffering was not as critical as our freedom, is our ability to find God in the darkness. There is often great lasting spiritual benefit in suffering, which the pandemic has certainly afforded us. What has the pandemic taught you? God allows us to suffer. That's a tough one. The Lord sometimes plays hardball with us when goodness itself is at stake. All we have to do is read history to find this out. So we need to be aware of our own tendency to ignore evil when it makes its pass at us. If we ignore evil, it grows. It gets more intense over generations. As an expert on the impact of denial, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, referring to the grief process, once referred to cancer as a profound blessing for some people, and she died of cancer. I see cancer as a violent assault on the body. She saw the importance of suffering as a tool to wake us up and to see the good embedded in it. The Lord himself suffered tremendously, and he spent a lot of his life doing what? Praying through the suffering. Swedenborg remarks that Jesus was constantly battling against evils passing through his person, evils of every kind. Yet as far as we know, because we don't seem to read it in the scriptures, the Lord did not experience illness in himself. This is interesting, isn't it? Nowhere do we read that Jesus got sick with a cold, with the flu, or any virus. And in fact, we only read that he healed those things. Jesus was constantly, by inner struggle, bringing himself back into order and aligning himself with the divine within. This is a mega clue. This is a mega clue for us. In our search for healing individually, as a nation, and as a world, we must work to bring ourselves back into better order by aligning ourselves more with the divine. And this is a call to the church, specific and universal, so that when pandemics emerge, and they have before, we know that studying history, what we're seeing is profound systemic disorder, manifesting in physical disease and death. What this calls forth from us is both individual effort and worldwide effort to bring us back into order. So my thoughts turn to the church's doctrine of the universal human. My mom mentioned this to me the other day, and I thought it was an inspired thought. It's important to reflect on the grand human at the earthly level. We don't often think on earth of operating day by day on the grand human level. But I propose that we invoke the whole of heaven in order to save the whole earth. I think it's time. In Swedenborg's works, he defines the universal human as the whole of all of God's creation, and it can be viewed as a human body, manifesting countless interrelated functions, exactly mirrored by all the various functions of the physical body. Wow. So that the human physiology presents a correspondential picture of the collective world of spirits, infilled with the divine. Holy cow. This is good stuff. This is great stuff. I just quoted from a Continuing Vision anthology edited by Robin Larson. Just a beautiful summary of the universal human. And I have something inside me that just says we need to pray to all of heaven now. An example of this universal human, this grand human, Homo Maximus, as we were hearing earlier, an example of the work of this happening is the United Nations. The different nations working together to help bring the world back into more order, a very worthy effort. I think of the Parliament of the world's religions. And there are just so many efforts. Churches can work together, different denominations work together. And we're the church, we're the vision that has it to do this. In Swedenborg's work, Heaven and Hell, number 56, this is awesome. This is again why our church has a vision of hope. The perfection of heaven is the result of variety. Oh. The perfection of heaven is the result of variety in worship. For unity to be perfect, it must be formed from various parts. That this is the origin of all perfection is evident from all the beauty, the pleasantness, and delight that affects the senses as well as the mind. For these to exist and flow from no other source than the concept and harmony of many concordant and harmonious parts, either coexisting simultaneously in order or following after in order. God's order is inexorably intertwined with diversity. If we're ever poised to make a difference in this world as a church, it's now. We have turned to the order of science to help bring the pandemic to an end. Here's a mantra that I've been living with for a week. Order itself is saving us. Order is saving us, and the way out of the pandemic is clear. And it must be noted, though, that bringing the world back into more order is really problematic, with the varying discordant beliefs and behaviors and degrees of perception, degrees of acceptance about science. So right now, of course, we know there's a great discord and division, a glaring lack of faith and charity about our differences. Boy, that's disturbing. Too many people see differences and variety as a problem. Too many see our differences and diversity as a threat, which causes a violent reaction from that perception, rather than a strength. I believe that we are in a tribulation. We are experiencing a judgment in the era of the new church. What do I mean by that? Swedenborg makes a distinction between the last judgment and a judgment. He says that the Christian church has already been through the last judgment because there was a lack of faith and charity. And around the time of the Enlightenment, when the mind opened up, Swedenborg gives us a specific year, in fact, 1757, but he talks about that the new church is being born and is on its way. We are in that wave. We are in that dispensation. But I want to give you just a brief paragraph from him, from Arcana Celestia 2118. This is a list of the last judgments, because he says there are several last judgments. There's 4, in fact. So, most of Christendom talks about the last judgment coming, and this is it, and the world's going to end. But Swedenborg doesn't talk that way. He doesn't write that way. He says that, and I'm going to quote this, there's a last judgment in the sense that every time an era of a church ends, that's the last judgment for that church. He also talks in terms of our individual last judgments, when our bodies die and then we cross over, and that's an individual process of unfolding with the Lord, with truth and mercy. But let's look at this just very briefly, the last judgments that have happened, so that in our mind we get a kind of a large view of where we're at now. There was a final judgment of the most ancient church when their posterity or future generations perished, whose destruction is described by the flood. That's first one he talks about. There was a final judgment, a last judgment of the ancient church, when almost all who were of that church became idolaters and were dispersed. There was a final judgment of the representative church, which succeeded among the posterity of Jacob, when the 10 tribes were led away into captivity and dispersed among the nations, and subsequently the Jewish people, after the advent of the Lord, were driven out of the land of Canaan and scattered over the whole earth. The last judgment of this church, the Christian church, is meant. So Swedenborg is saying that the last judgment of the Christian church has happened, and we are now in the new church. And there is the new church specific, meaning the New Jerusalem, the organization that we are all a part of and that give meaning to our lives. But he also talks about the new church universal. So let us be clear that the new church involves all. The new church involves a new dispensation to all people. Swedenborg asserts, now this should give us some comfort if we put our stock in Swedenborg, that the Last Judgment does not involve the destruction of the world. When looking through the lens of the spiritual sense of the word, as opposed to the literal sense alone, the passages in the word where it speaks of the destruction of heaven and earth speak to the ending of the Christian church. And what's interesting is he talks about how the Christian church in heaven ended. And then the Christian church on earth, the era of that church ended on earth. Remember, we talked about spiritual being causal, and then the natural realm follows. So what we celebrate with the new church is that first the new church was born in heaven, and it follows now on earth. It's a beautiful thing. So Swedenborg says the new heaven is the new church in heaven, and the new earth is the establishment of the new church on earth, of which we are a part. So we see that the heavens and earth, now this is, I think, an exciting thought, something you can take with you. The heavens and the earth are constantly in flux, constant movement. The church itself goes through fluctuations. It goes through changes, it goes through death, and it goes through rebirth. So to be clear, a judgment takes place when evil has been brought to its height, or it is as it has been expressed in the word, when evil has been consummated. And I propose that we are in a judgment. I believe evil has been consummated, or when iniquity has been consummated. He says the case is this: all evil has its limits. That's good news, as far as which it is permitted to go by the divine. But when evil is carried beyond these limits, the transgressor runs into the punishment of evil, and this in particular, and this in general. The punishment of evil is what is called a judgment. The last judgment takes place again when there's an end to the era of a church. And the end of the church is when there is no faith, because there is no charity. Swedenborg asserts that the chief reason a judgment takes place is that the equilibrium between heaven and hell is at risk. In fact, he says a judgment is happening when we begin to perish in those things, in love and faith. And I do believe that we are experiencing a tipping toward evil in general at this time. I believe that we are seeing this pendulum swing toward hell at this time. Not that it will continue on, and I don't think the earth is going to end. I think Swedenborg's right. But I think it is allowed to a degree for the pendulum to swing that way. And I think that's why we have so much chaos and so much turmoil, and we're experiencing at an energetic level a lot of chaotic energy. It is important to note in Swedenborg that sometimes, and this is my favorite quote of all of his quotes, sometimes it is necessary that everything must fall apart completely before the Lord can come in and bring it back into better order. That's why I think ultimately this is allowed, because we will evolve. We see through human history that after every pandemic, great advancements in humankind are made. But I'm also talking at the spiritual level, so that the Lord is rearranging the parts that are not working well in us and among us. So regarding the two troubling issues in our time of violence and the pandemic, I do believe we are in a judgment, and a profound decline of faith and charity is happening, and that evil has been consummated. And the consequence of that is what we're going through. And of course, both these issues are complex and have worldly causes as well, and those are to continue to be examined and rectified. The new church has an opportunity here to step up with our doctrine. I agree with Karen Feil. It's time that we let our doctrine give hope. And there's so many touch points that have been mentioned today that we can jump off of, that can give people hope. And also, it's also very important to recognize that the new church universal, in the best of ways, is showing itself and helping to heal. And I think of how, when we're in the pandemic, I think of all the human beings, individuals in the medical field who are helping to save lives. I think of all the people who are taking a stand with racial injustice, and people who, in general, are waking up. You know, if we just look at the things that are loud and noisy, we can give up and feel hopeless. But if we attune ourselves to the divine and align ourselves, you know, paralleling what Jesus did, he aligned himself to be in order with the divine within in order to withstand what he had to go through. There's so much good out there happening at the universal human level. And that is to be equally praised and recognized today. So we offer hope as a church. And so I've made a list of the different ways. And at the very end of this list, as we conclude, are interesting thoughts from Swedenborg from the book, The Last Judgement. But just briefly, to say from the dispensation of the new church, which started in 1757, we see the age of the Enlightenment, ideals of liberty, tolerance, and progress. And then we see an opening of the human mind. This is something that continually, perpetually happens, so that we question religious orthodoxy and we have freedom of inquiry. We have an open-mindedness about ourselves in this day. There's an ongoing emphasis of science and the advancements of science to conquer disease and explore new dimensions of reality. There's tremendous chaos, but the universal human says this is signaling a reordering of the divine. So take heart and be of good courage. In Luke 21:36, keep awake, keep alert at all times, and pray that you may have strength to escape these things that are about to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. The new church is similar to the Christian church, and this is where I'm drawing from The Last Judgement from Swedenborg. And this is interesting stuff if you haven't read it. He says the new church, which this is the era we're in, is similar to the Christian church in its outward nature, but dissimilar as to the internal form. Churches will still be divided, we know that. Doctrines will still be taught, we know that. But spiritual liberty is restored, and all things in heaven and hell are in their order. This is interesting. There will be fluctuations in heavenly influences and hellish influences, as well as divine intervention to restore balance. The spiritual sense of the word, as we know, is unveiled. Interior truths are revealed. The state of the church in the future and the knowledge of things to come, and this is an important one, belong to the Lord alone. He says that specifically in the Last Judgment. The things that are to come are known to the Lord alone. So that means, this is a reminder to all of us, that we must trust the divine. Though everything is falling apart, it feels like things are falling apart, and they're allowed to be, so that they can be brought back into better order. So we must trust that process and trust our relationship with the Lord and build that relationship. He says, this is interesting too, angels have slender hope of the people of the Christian church. And he says, there will be a nation. There is a nation distant from the Christian world, removed from the infestors of the Christian world, that will receive spiritual light and become celestial spiritual people. Interior truths are received in their life, and they are received in their heart. And this nation, this group of people, worship the Lord. So he gives us this sort of general sense that, aside from much of Christianity that's lost its charity, there is a nation, there is a group that is celestial spiritual. And so the call for us is to go within, to the internal place. So we see from all of this, as we wrap up, that the Swedenborgian perspective gives us great hope. Please hear me when I say we have hope. If indeed his vision is true, and I believe that it is, the world will not end. We are in a time of a judgment. The influx of the divine is restoring order in the necessary chaos. And there is a good group of people, a nation, he says, receiving the Lord in life and in heart. Are we part of this nation? I believe so. We're part of it. We're not it totally, but we're part of it. So what can we do? We can pray to be in alignment with the order of God, because God alone knows the future. We can take action through our uses, through the things that we love the most. We can try and strive to make a difference in this world. And I make a call out to all of us to pray to the universal human, to pray to all of heaven, to help the whole earth, all of our brothers and sisters, because we all need help now. And that is a hopeful prayer. Amen. So it's 5:18, and I want to make sure that we can answer, or I can respond to some of your questions, your comments. Alex or Emily, how do I see those? Let's see the chat. Oh, there we go. Okay, seeing some affirmation. Thank you very much.
I did see one question in the chat, Renee. It said from Julie Conneran, and
Yes.
it says, where does Swedenborg speak about the church specific and universal?
Well, what I'll do, Julie, is I will find that for you, and I will get back with you. I know how to find you. I don't have that right here with me, but I can get that to you.
And then there's another one that says, again from Julie, I wonder if the threat to the world by climate change is an external result of that evil.
Yes, well, definitely. And I struggled with whether to do climate change, but I think it absolutely is a violence. It's a violence to the planet, it's a violence to God, and a violence to each other. So yes, I think that what we're dealing with the climate change is a consequence. Swedenborg talks about consequences of our selfishness. And that's what we're having to deal with. We're taking a bitter pill now because we've just done too much of what we've wanted to do without thought of the larger good. Yes, Julie. Yep. Thank you for bringing that up.
And I don't see any others, but I missed it. It had been answered about Julie's earlier question. One place that's referenced is in Heaven and Hell number 308.
Oh, who did that? Julie? Who did that?
I believe it was Kit. Yes,
Yeah,
Kit.
Kit did it. Kit gave you the info.
Thank you, brother. Yeah, good.
Okay, here's one more from Michael. Any Swedenborg advice for a person suffering and struggling with hypochondria?
Hypochondria. Remind me again the definition.
It's like an intense fear of something.
I think it has to do with the health.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. An intense fear of that. Well, I would say being true to Swedenborg and then being true to my own chaplain experience, I would say the first reality is that you're being attacked by hell in that way, like we all would be. And you're not alone. I mean, we're in dialogue with heaven and hell every moment of every day. So it's not like you're evil or anything or in a hellish state. But so really that kind of fear is coming from the hells. So I would say number one, just know that and recognize, as Swedenborg says, that anything that is disorderly in us or anything that is from hell, that belongs to hell. That does not mean that you are evil. But to recognize that those are the hells attacking you and to pray and ask the Lord to fight for you. One of my mentors is Reverend Gladys Wheaton, and the last mentoring that we had together, a conversation, she was saying that because I have lupus, and sometimes I get scared of my health too, so I get infested and attacked as well, because sometimes I feel scared about my health and I get overly concerned and it kind of ruins my moments. And she said, at those moments, pray to the crucified Lord, not to be morose or gross, but she said it's especially powerful to think of our Lord on the cross suffering and to ask him to do that for us. So that when we're scared about our health or just sort of a generalized fear of hypochondria, we need to ask the Lord specifically to step in front of us and to do those kinds of things for us, with us, but in front of us. And then also, I would say hypochondria is a generalized fear. So there's something specific underneath the hypochondria that could be explored with counseling. It could be explored with a spiritual director. I know I've done both. And when I was in ordination training, I used to see a Jesuit priest in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who, when I was struggling with a bit of that after being raped, he said, what you want to do is you want to see Jesus touching your body and just touching your body where it hurts, or maybe just your body in general. And then you stop thinking about that, you walk away and you do something else. The reason that this Jesuit priest suggested this for hypochondria and for fear in general is that we tend to want to, because God gave us this amazing brain and mind, we tend to want to control the outcome of the touch. But he suggested that we just, in prayerful visualization, see Jesus touching our body, and then we just let that be and go about doing something else. We don't try to control or manipulate the outcome, because the Lord has a greater opportunity to bless us when we're not trying to overthink our fearful things. So those are some thoughts for me, but I would say just remember that any attack like that, any real generalized fear comes from hell. It doesn't mean you're evil. It just means, because we all go through these times, I do, where we just recognize what it is and we ask the Lord to stand in front of us with it. And we actually visualize seeing him touch us. And if counseling and spiritual direction are helpful, or go to somebody that you really trust, and you continue to process what that is about, because it is an infestation. Yeah.
May I offer a thought?
Yes. Who is that?
This is Eric.
Yes.
Awesome presentation, very thought-provoking. It reminded me of something that sustains me when watching the news. If it were not for chaos and breaking down, caterpillars could never become butterflies.
Beautiful.
Very good.
Oh, that's good.
Beautiful.
I'm also on the subject of violence. I think there's a very important distinction to be made between violence and aggression. Love can never be conveyed violently, but love can be conveyed aggressively. So the problem is there's a thin line between the two.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. We have to make sure that fear is never involved in that decision. So,
Yeah.
but thank you for the present. I've got more, but I don't type that fast. So.
Oh, well, let's talk later.
I think we need to.
Okay.
Thank you very much, kiddo. Good job.
Thank you. Thank you. Ooh, I got a kiddo.
Renee,
Renee, that was a good job.
Renee, this
Yes,
is Martha.
Martha.
Hi.
Hi.
I think what we just always need to remember that God is in charge.
Yes.
You know, that if we just, that's where we put our faith, and when we look toward, everything will be all right.
Yep. I do, Martha. I so trust that. I do believe that though the pendulum is swinging roughly toward the darkness right now, I trust the divine knows what's going on, and it's for our evolutionary progress. And I believe Swedenborg when he says that over time we evolve. And well, like Eric's reference to the caterpillar, it involves breaking completely apart.
That's right. I also think that we in the United States are seeing more now, and there's always been a lot around the world. The pandemic, of course, is global, and everybody saw that. But I think that we now are experiencing more than we used to, and maybe that we can feel that more.
I bet you that's very true. Yeah, I think
because if you look at history and things, there's been specific areas all over the world that have seen a lot of violence.
Yep. That's right. And it isn't new, Martha. It really isn't new. I mean, if you think about the Crusades, if you think about the Dark Ages, if you think about wars, I just, yeah.
And I think everything is multiplied now by our being able to see everything at once. When I was a little girl, if there was mass shooting somewhere, we probably wouldn't have known we didn't have a television. So I don't know when we would have known. Maybe some way down, maybe 2 or 3 years. Who would know if we'd ever find out? But now, before it's even over, it's on the television, and it doesn't matter where in the world it is. And so all that is multiplied. we see it all.
Yeah.
We don't just see what's happening in our neighborhood.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I don't know. And, and it seems like, and I don't know if I'm seeing this right, but it just seems like there's just so much road rage. I mean, we had somebody,
Oh,
somebody just, more than, I'm kind of telling my age, I'm relatively young to be a pastor, but a minister, but, I remember in the 70s and the 80s, what was road rage? I don't remember that at all. And now
No.
we just had a gun put to our window at our car, and people just,
Oh man.
it's just crazy out there now. So you're right. It's on the boob tube, and then, it's
when I think when evil is perpetuated, that it gives it a foothold and it grows.
yes.
And so people, I don't know. It's like two ball teams, and one ball team might be a loser, but if something happens and they get a win, they get really fired up, and then they become the one that's the real winner for a while, until, you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yes, I do. Yep. Yeah, you're seeing a lot of important angles to this. Yeah. Yeah, I think, and I think you're right. One of the first things that you said, that I think we're more sensitive. I think we're picking up and we're being bombarded, if you will.
And I do think that there's a lower, I don't know, a lower amount of caring or something, or respect and for other people and life in general.
Mm. Well, I think that's true among many. And I have to say, because of the circles, that I'm in at the hospital and with the police and whatever, at the church, of course, I see so many beautiful people, so many good people, so the good is not lacking in our world. It is just much more, I think, humble, quiet. I think it works at a deeper level, which is what Swedenborgian, the Last Judgement, he's telling us, we must go within to really see.
Yeah, and don't be boastful. People aren't out there tooting their own horns when they're doing all of these things, which is the correct way to do it. Be humbly charitable and not, but what we do see is this evil. The news they love to show it.
Yeah.
They don't know what to do if there's not some kind of big thing they can put on the TV. Really, they.
Yeah, Martha, that's what I was just going to add is what I've seen for so many years is that the media, which I think overall does a really good job, but they do tend to focus much more on the negative and the violent and, the evil stuff. When, like you're saying, Renee, I was just going to throw that out there, that think of every day of the millions of good things that people do and say, but it never makes the news.
Yeah. Yep.
I know that Channel 6, the national news, at the very end, they'll have one little segment of something good, but the whole other news is bad or real controversial.
Well, and I think that's the power of the church. The church is a place where hopefully, where we can bring the good to light, if not on a weekly basis, some level of contact with our fellow brothers and sisters in faith. The church is where we experience intentionally and directly the Lord's goodness. And so that's why the church won't die. But what we need is, if I'm understanding the Last Judgment correctly, if I am, it needs to be a place that helps us go within. Also to be taking action in justice issues for sure. But it also must start with an internal connection with the divine, so that we're starting out with that, so that Martha, we see through the Lord's goodness into the world and we don't get too overwhelmed. If we don't have that connection with the divine, it's going to be, the world is too overwhelming. It's just, there's so much negativity. But the church can provide programs and experiences that help us go within to that place, that place of light and life. And that's the nation he's talking about, the celestial spiritual nation.
I think that's true. And I think that we learn it there, or we understand that there. But then I think individually, then in every encounter, we have to put that into use.
Yes.
You
yes.
know,
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
I can't live any other way now. And I'm not, and I'm really not, the news and things don't really, I mean, yes, they upset me when I see bad things happening, but I don't get overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
Because
yeah, I'm thinking of our youth right now. Our youth are experiencing hopelessness because things are so out of order. And they don't even think that they necessarily will live a full lifetime because of the planet, and because of how things are that way, because of disease, because, and violence and all the problems with racism. And they're, from what I'm hearing from our youth, they're being bombarded too much with everything that's wrong. So I don't.
Well, I can give you hope. I have 2 granddaughters that live with me. Both of them are very, very spiritual. And I would say already that they're, especially one of them, the youngest, is on a way to that real connection with God.
Beautiful.
She understands who she is. I'll tell you, no one treats her badly. No one says anything badly because she says she's worthy.
Wow.
She's a child of God, and
Wow.
she doesn't need to be taught too badly. She doesn't need to be treated badly.
Beautiful.
And she has a lot of spiritual strength, and so she doesn't worry about what's coming.
How old is she?
She'll be 20 in July.
Wow. Well,
yes.
we have a future.
Yes. Well, I always say that when I see these 2 girls, because they were in Girl Up and the things that matter at school, they Girl Up, and I was trying to think of the other one, where they, responsible clubs, and yeah, they both. So I think there is hope, Renee.
So do I. Yeah.
And I think probably everyone here does, or they wouldn't be here.
That's right.
And
thank you for being here.
And God bless you all.
God bless you.
God bless.